They were loud, fast, and built with no limits. But some American cars crossed the line. Too powerful, too dangerous, or too dirty for the road. These machines were banned, recalled, or buried by the very companies that made them. From muscle cars that broke emissions laws to experimental beasts that terrified safety testers, their stories were almost erased. These are the outlaws of American motoring, 10 banned cars that automakers don't want you to remember.
The Chevrolet Corvair stands as one of the most controversial cars in American history, a brilliant concept destroyed by fatal engineering flaws and corporate arrogance. Introduced in 1959 for the 1960 model year, the Corvair was unlike anything General Motors had ever built. It was light, nimble, and powered by a rear-mounted, air-cooled flat-six engine, a radical departure from Detroit's front-engine rear-drive formula. GM's dream was to create an American car that could compete with the Volkswagen Beetle and the nimble European compacts emerging after the war. The result was a car that looked sophisticated and futuristic, with clean lines, no bulky front grille, and a modern unibody design. But behind the innovation lay danger. The Corvair's engineering missteps would turn it into one of the most infamous cars ever sold in the United States. The trouble began with the suspension. In an effort to save weight and keep costs low, GM used a swing axle rear suspension similar to early Volkswagens. On paper, it made sense. It was light and simple. But in reality, it was dangerously unstable. When cornering, the swing axles caused the rear wheels to tuck under the car, dramatically altering camber and leading to sudden oversteer. Without a front anti-roll bar to counteract the effect, the Corvair became treacherous at the limits. Drivers who entered a turn too fast or lifted off the throttle mid-corner could find the rear end whipping around violently. Test drivers reported that the car could bite back without warning, spinning or rolling over with almost no recovery window. Ordinary families unused to handling such quirks were suddenly faced with a car that required sports car precision to keep on the road. Ralph Nader's landmark book, 1965, Unsafe at Any Speed, brought the Corvair's flaws into the national spotlight. Nader accused GM of putting style and cost-cutting ahead of safety, describing the Corvair as a one-car accident machine. His criticism wasn't limited to the Corvair. The book attacked the entire auto industry for neglecting safety, but the Corvair became its symbol. GM's reaction only made things worse. Instead of addressing the engineering issues, the company hired private investigators to follow and harass Nader, an act that became a national scandal when exposed. Public outrage was swift, and Congress soon launched hearings on automotive safety. The Corvair, once a hopeful experiment in innovation, became a cautionary tale that reshaped American automotive regulation forever. The damage was irreversible. Though GM made major improvements for the second-generation Corvair in 1965, including a fully independent rear suspension that cured its handling problems, the public had already turned against it. Sales plummeted from over 250,000 units a year to barely 25,000 by 1969. Dealers couldn't give them away. The Corvair name had become toxic, synonymous with corporate recklessness and danger. Even though later tests by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration concluded that the 1960-63 Corvairs were no more unstable than similar cars of the time, the reputation stuck. Perception had become reality, and the Corvair became a symbol of everything wrong with Detroit's attitude towards safety. Yet, despite its infamy, the Corvair was also a masterpiece of design and imagination. Its rear-mounted engine freed up space for a flat floor and roomy interior, while its unibody construction made it light and responsive. Enthusiasts today praise its smooth flat six, available turbocharging, the first in an American production car, and surprisingly refined handling, at least in later versions. But in the 1960s, none of that mattered. The damage had been done. The Corvair's downfall helped spark the creation of the NHTSA, the introduction of seatbelts, crash standards, and a new era of accountability in American car design. Owners who remember the Corvair often speak with a mix of affection and frustration. One former driver described it as the most fun car I ever feared. Another said, "It drove like a European car, until it didn't. For them, the Corvair represented both the best and worst of American ambition, a car that dared to be different but paid the price for its flaws. By the time production ended in 1969, the Corvair had become more than a failed car. It was a national turning point. Its legacy wasn't horsepower or performance, but regulation and reform. It forced an entire industry to take safety seriously for the first time. The Corvair story is tragic, but its impact was monumental. It may have died in shame, but in doing so, it saved lives and changed the course of automotive history.
The Ford Mustang Boss 429 was the ultimate example of American muscle gone too far. A car built not for showrooms or suburban streets, but for racetrack domination and engineering pride. Conceived in the heat of NASCAR's horsepower wars, the Boss 429 was Ford's answer to Chrysler's legendary 426 Hemi, a direct attempt to seize control of stock car racing by brute mechanical force. But to race the monstrous 429 cubic inch semi-Hemi V8 legally, Ford needed to produce a limited number of street legal versions. Thus, between 1969 and 1970, just 1,358 examples of the Boss 429 Mustang were born, each one hand-assembled, wild, and nearly uncontrollable. It wasn't just a car. It was an act of rebellion against reason, an engine barely caged inside a Mustang's body. The story began with Ford's racing division, Carcraft, a small but elite workshop in Brighton, Michigan, responsible for the GT40 and the Le Mans program. The standard Mustang was never designed to fit the Boss 429 engine. It was far too large. So Carcraft was tasked with re-engineering the front end, cutting, reshaping, and reinforcing everything from the shock towers to the radiator support. The engine, officially rated at 375 horsepower, was a lie. Ford lowballed the number to appease insurance companies. In truth, the Boss 429 made well over 500 horsepower in racing trim and closer to 475 in street form. It was an all-aluminum monster with hemispherical combustion chambers, massive intake ports, and a solid lifter camshaft so aggressive that it barely idled under 1,200 RPM. On cold mornings, it would cough, shake, and protest, demanding high-octane fuel and a skilled foot on the throttle to stay alive. Driving one was an experience that bordered on the violent. The engine's power delivery was unpredictable, docile 1 second, explosive the next. It would rocket from 0 to 60 miles per hour in under 6 seconds, even with its lazy 3.91 rear gears, and stretch to speeds that terrified drivers of the time. But it wasn't designed for city driving or traffic lights. Its massive hood scoop wasn't just for looks. It fed an engine that inhaled air like a jet turbine. The cooling system struggled constantly, and the car would overheat and slow traffic within minutes. The steering was heavy, the ride harsh, and the idle rough enough to shake mirrors loose. But when you buried the throttle and the big semi-Hemi roared to life, all sins were forgiven. The sound was a raw, metallic thunder that few cars before or since have matched. What ultimately doomed the Boss 429 wasn't its performance, it was its timing. The Clean Air Act of 1970 and tightening federal emissions regulations made its enormous engine completely unviable for road use. The Boss 429 could never meet pollution limits, not even close. Its compression ratio of 11.1 was meant for race fuel, not unleaded street gasoline. Inspectors refused to even test it in some states, citing excessive exhaust emissions and noise levels well beyond federal limits. By the end of 1970, Ford's engineers knew the era was over. The Boss 429 had served its purpose, Ford had its NASCAR homologation, and the beast was quietly retired. But the car's legend grew. Enthusiasts and collectors began to realize how special it was, a factory Mustang with one of the most advanced and powerful engines ever built by Ford. Only 859 were made in 1969 and 499 in 1970, making it one of the rarest Mustangs ever built. Each car was numbered, hand-modified, and subtly different. Its price today exceeds $500,000 in pristine condition, but even money can't replicate the experience of driving one. Owners described it as a car that hates idling and loves speed, or more vividly, a Mustang that would rather die on the track than live in a garage. The Boss 429's influence extended far beyond its short production run. It became a symbol of the last gasp of unrestricted American horsepower, a car born at the peak of muscle car madness, extinguished by the dawn of regulation. It never belonged on the street, and Ford knew it. It was a street car in name only, a thin disguise for a racing engine so wild that it defied the laws of both mechanics and bureaucracy. Today, when one fires up at a car show, the ground still trembles. Its deep, uneven rumble is a reminder of a time when Detroit built machines not for efficiency or comfort, but for glory. Raw, unfiltered, mechanical glory. The Boss 429 was too fast, too loud, and too powerful for its own good, and that is precisely why it remains one of the most worshipped, feared, and unforgettable Mustangs ever built.
The Plymouth Superbird was one of the most audacious, outlandish, and misunderstood cars ever to come out of Detroit. A vehicle that looked like a cartoon rocket, but was, in fact, one of the most advanced aerodynamic experiments of its day. It was born out of pure racing obsession, designed not for comfort, luxury, or style, but to dominate NASCAR. And it did so with such devastating efficiency that it was banned almost immediately after. The Superbird was a car that proved just how far American engineers were willing to go to win, even if it meant building something that looked like it had escaped from a wind tunnel and crash-landed in a dealership. In 1969, Dodge had stunned the racing world with the Charger Daytona, a car so fast that it became the first NASCAR machine to break 200 miles per hour on a closed course. Plymouth, feeling left behind, demanded its own version. The company wanted to bring superstar driver Richard Petty back into their camp after he had defected to Ford in frustration over Plymouth's lack of competitiveness. The result was the 1970 Superbird, an even more extreme evolution of the Daytona, with sharper aerodynamics, cleaner lines, and a nose cone nearly 2 feet long. Its most famous feature was, of course, that towering rear wing, a 23-inch aluminum airfoil mounted high enough to clear the trunk lid and sit in the clean air flowing over the roof. Engineers swore it wasn't for show. Wind tunnel tests proved it provided real downforce at high speeds, but on the street it looked utterly ridiculous. Under the hood, the Superbird offered 3 engines, each one a legend in its own right. The 440 cubicle Super Commando, the 440 six-pack with triple 2-barrel carburetors, and the top-tier 426 Hemi, officially rated at 425 horsepower, but capable of far more in racing trim. With its aerodynamic body and monstrous engines, the Superbird could exceed 140 miles per hour easily, and in NASCAR trim it touched 200 miles per hour, speeds unthinkable for a car with steel bumpers and a license plate. Petty himself dominated the 1970 season, and rival teams complained that the Superbird and its Dodge cousin had turned NASCAR into a one-sided war. The officials responded by changing the rules. For 1971, aero cars were restricted to smaller engines no larger than 305 cubic inches, effectively neutering their power. It was a bureaucratic death sentence. The Superbird was banned not for cheating, but for being too good. The irony was that on the street, the same qualities that made it a legend on the track made it nearly undrivable for ordinary buyers. The nose cone made parking a nightmare. The rear view blocked half the rear view, and its size, over 18 feet long, made it almost absurd to maneuver in city traffic. Dealers across America found themselves stuck with Superbirds that no one wanted. In an era of subtle Mustangs and sleek Camaros, this giant-winged missile looked insane. Some dealers went so far as to remove the nose cones and wings, converting them back into regular Roadrunners or Chargers just to sell them. Reports from the time tell of cars sitting on lots for years, discounted and unloved, a sad fate for one of the most technically advanced cars ever built by Chrysler. But the Superbird's reputation didn't stay buried. By the 1980s, collectors began to realize its significance.
It wasn't just a muscle car, it was a piece of racing history, a rolling monument to an era when engineers were given free rein to chase speed without fear of regulations or cost. Only 1,935 Superbirds were built, and even fewer survived unmodified. Today, an original Hemi Superbird can fetch over $500,000, and when one appears at an auction or show, it draws crowds like a UFO. Owners who drive them today describe the experience as surreal. The front end stretches endlessly ahead, and the car feels more like a jet than a car. The engine note is deep and thunderous, and above 70 miles per hour, the aerodynamic design actually starts to work. The car hunkers down, smooths out, and becomes eerily stable. One owner famously said, "Below 80, it's a handful. Above 100, it feels like it's on rails." It's as if the Superbird was designed not for this world, but for another, a realm of open runways and endless straights. The Plymouth Superbird remains one of the most iconic and controversial creations in American automotive history. It was built for one man, banned for its brilliance, mocked for its looks, and worshipped for its legacy. It represents the pinnacle of the muscle car era, a time when the only limit was imagination, and when engineers believed that, with enough horsepower and courage, even a brick could fly. The Superbird didn't just race, it redefined speed itself. And though NASCAR and the public weren't ready for it, history has crowned it what it truly was, the outlaw king of American aerodynamics.
The 1969 Chevrolet Camaro ZL1 is one of those rare American machines that seemed too wild, too powerful, and too advanced for the era that created it. A car that could outgun anything else on the road and even make seasoned racers nervous. It was a monster in the skin of a commuter coupe, a predator disguised as a pony car. The ZL1 looked like an ordinary Camaro SS from a distance, but under that familiar sheet metal hid something closer to a missile than a muscle car. A hand-built, all-aluminum, 427 cubic-inch big block engine derived straight from Chevrolet's top-secret Can-Am racing program. It was meant to dominate the drag strip, and it did, but its sheer, uncontrollable fury terrified insurers, dealers, and even Chevrolet itself. The story began when Illinois dealer Fred Gibb, a seasoned drag racer and Chevrolet loyalist, wanted to create the ultimate factory drag car. He used Chevrolet's COPO, Central Office Production Order System, a loophole usually reserved for fleet buyers and police packages, to special order Camaros with the ZL1 racing engine, an ultralight, ultra-powerful power plant designed for the track, not the street. The aluminum block was experimental technology in 1969, saving nearly 100 pounds over the cast-iron 427s used in Corvettes. Officially, Chevrolet rated it at 430 horsepower, but that was a bureaucratic lie to appease regulators and insurance companies. In reality, dyno tests showed figures well over 500 horsepower, some claiming closer to 550. It was raw, loud, and violent, with a compression ratio of 12.0 to 1 that made it run best on race fuel, and a mechanical cam so wild it idled like a jackhammer. The car's performance was staggering. In stock form, a ZL1 could sprint the quarter mile in the low 11s on slicks, territory normally reserved for purpose-built dragsters. On the street, it could out-accelerate anything short of a full race car. Test drivers said the rear tires vaporized instantly under throttle, and the torque was so overwhelming that even experienced racers struggled to keep it straight. But the ZL1 wasn't just fast, it was unforgiving. With no power steering or power brakes, heavy clutch action, and a tendency to overheat in traffic, it was a car that demanded total respect. More than one buyer who expected a faster SS Camaro found themselves utterly terrified after a single drive. Chevrolet's corporate management quickly realized they had a problem. The ZL1 wasn't a production car. It was a barely tamed race engine stuffed into a street chassis. Each engine alone cost over $4,000 to build, nearly doubling the base price of the car. Dealers couldn't sell them, and most sat unsold for months. Fred Gibbs Chevrolet took delivery of the first 50 cars, but managed to sell only a handful. Many were shipped to other dealers across the country, where they languished on lots until price cuts made them marginally affordable to brave buyers. By the time production stopped, only 69 ZL1 Camaros had been built, one for each car collector's dream list ever since. Then came the bans. Drag strips across the U.S. began forbidding ZL1s from competing in standard production classes because they were simply too fast for existing safety equipment. Their unmodified frames twisted under full power, and the rear suspensions couldn't handle the violent torque loads. Insurance companies caught wind of the car's potential and blacklisted it almost instantly, refusing to cover them under standard policies. Even Chevrolet's own PR department distanced themselves, quietly pulling promotional materials and instructing dealers not to discuss the ZL1's true horsepower figures. Owners who managed to tame one described the experience with awe and fear in equal measure. "It didn't accelerate, it detonated," said one original owner who raced his ZL1 in 1970. "You felt like you were being pulled into the future by an explosion behind your seat." Another claimed it made a Corvette feel like a taxi. The ZL1 had no luxury, no comfort, no compromise. It was an engine with a car barely built around it. In hindsight, the 1969 ZL1 was a glimpse of what American muscle could have become, if not for government regulation and corporate fear. It was Chevrolet's unfiltered power fantasy, an engineering statement that said, "We can build anything if we dare." But the world wasn't ready for it. Emission standards, insurance crackdowns, and safety laws were about to crush the muscle car era, and the ZL1 was its final defiant roar. Today, each surviving ZL1 is worth millions, revered as one of the rarest and most legendary Camaros ever made. At car shows, its deep metallic growl still turns heads and silences conversations. It represents a time when American performance had no leash, when engineers built cars not to comply, but to conquer. The 1969 Camaro ZL1 was banned, buried, and forgotten by its own maker. But half a century later, it stands as proof that once, even Detroit dared to build something too powerful for the world to handle.
The 1969 Dodge Charger 500 Hemi is one of those rare machines that lives in the shadow of its own descendants, a forgotten bridge between the raw brutality of the muscle car era and the aerodynamic revolution that would soon follow. Everyone remembers the wild-winged Charger Daytona and its cousin, the Plymouth Superbird, but few recall the car that started it all. The Charger 500 was Dodge's first serious attempt to beat the wind and NASCAR at their own game. Built for speed at any cost, it was a car so ahead of its time that the rulebook had to be rewritten just to contain it. For one glorious, roaring season, it was the fastest thing on the track and too extreme for the streets that birthed it. The standard 1968 Charger had the looks, one of the most iconic shapes in muscle car history, but aerodynamically, it was a disaster. The recessed grille acted like a parachute, and the fastback rear window created lift that made the car unstable above 130 miles per hour. At high-speed NASCAR superspeedways like Daytona and Talladega, this was a death sentence. Dodge's engineers, led by the determined Larry Rathgeb, were told to fix the problem, and they did it with a vengeance. The Charger 500 wasn't a styling exercise. It was pure function wrapped in muscle. The flush-mounted coronet grille and flush rear window, borrowed and reworked from the corporate parts bin, transformed the car from a stylish street bruiser into an aerodynamic weapon. It cut through the air with precision, reducing drag and increasing stability dramatically. Wind tunnel testing showed a massive improvement, enough to turn a mid-pack Charger into a record-breaking contender. Under the hood lurked the beast that made the Charger name legendary, the 426 cubic inch Hemi V8. With dual four-barrel carburetors and hemispherical combustion chambers, it was a thunderous, all-business power plant built for domination. Officially rated at 425 horsepower, most insiders agreed that figure was wildly conservative. The real output hovered around 480 to 500 horsepower. And with its heavy-duty suspension, reinforced driveline, and factory racing credentials, the Charger 500 could hit 150 miles per hour without breaking a sweat. Drivers described it as brutally fast, yet eerily stable. A rare balance in those days of brute force engineering. On the NASCAR track, the results were instant. In 1969, the Charger 500 began embarrassing the competition, including Ford's Torino Talladegas. It was smoother, faster, and tougher, taking firsts and top finishes wherever it appeared. Richard Petty, who had left Plymouth to drive a Ford, reportedly took one look at the 500's performance and realized Dodge was rewriting the rulebook. The car's streamlined profile and powerful Hemi turned it into a missile, and suddenly, NASCAR found itself in the middle of an aerodynamic arms race. Dodge had fired the first shot, and the world's fastest stock cars would never be the same again. But while the 500 ruled the track, it stumbled on the street. The aerodynamic improvements that made it a winner in NASCAR made it oddly impractical as a daily driver. The flat grille gave it a stark, almost severe look that confused casual buyers. The reworked rear window, meant to reduce lift, shrunk visibility to almost nothing. And that mighty 426 Hemi, though magnificent at full throttle, was temperamental in traffic, idling roughly and devouring fuel like no tomorrow. Most were equipped with Hemi-duty 4-speed manuals or torque-flight automatics and lacked power accessories, all to save weight. For customers who wanted a comfortable cruiser, the 500 was simply too raw. The bigger problem, however, was regulation. By 1969, the government was tightening its grip on emissions and safety standards, and the 426 Hemi engine, a racing motor masquerading as a production unit, was suddenly under fire. It couldn't meet emissions limits without strangling its power, and Dodge had no intention of watering down its crown jewel. The Charger 500, like so many purebred performance cars of its era, was built for a brief, glorious window in time that was closing fast. By the 1970 model year, new emission laws effectively banned the Hemi-powered 500 from street sale. Dodge responded by going even more radical, developing the Charger Daytona with its towering wing and needle nose, but the 500's run was over almost as soon as it began. Only about 500 Charger 500s were ever built, and fewer than 120 of those were ordered with the mighty Hemi. Each one was hand-modified by Creative Industries of Detroit, which grafted on the flush panels by hand, making them some of the most labor-intensive Mopars ever produced. Dealers struggled to sell them, and many languished on lots next to cheaper, flashier Charger RTs. It was a car misunderstood in its own time, too subtle to impress showrooms, too extreme to live in the real world. One surviving owner, interviewed decades later, summed it up perfectly. It looked like a Charger that had been smoothed by the wind, and when you hit the gas, it felt like the air parted for you. Another called it the most serious car Dodge ever built because it didn't care about anything but speed. Today, the Charger 500 stands as a crucial yet overlooked chapter in Dodge history. The missing link between brute force and aerodynamic science. It proved that aerodynamics mattered as much as horsepower, paving the way for the Daytona and Superbird's legendary success. Yet its own story was cut short by the same regulations that ended the muscle car golden age. For a fleeting season, The Charger 500 Hemi was the king of speed, a car so advanced that even NASCAR had to change its rules to slow it down. Then, like a storm that passes too fast to be caught, it was gone, erased by the laws of a new era, leaving behind only a whisper of the wind that once screamed past its sculpted body at 190 miles per hour.
The 1973 to 1974 Pontiac Firebird Trans Am SD455 was the last defiant war cry of the American muscle car before the darkness of the 1970s swallowed it whole. It was a car that should not have existed, born in a time when horsepower was being hunted down by emissions laws, insurance surcharges, and an oil crisis that made performance seem almost immoral. Yet against all odds, Pontiac's engineers built one final monster. The Super Duty Trans Am wasn't just a muscle car, it was a rebellion on four wheels, a mechanical middle finger to the bureaucrats who were trying to neuter Detroit's wildest creations. To understand how the SD455 came to life, you have to remember where Pontiac was in the early 1970s. The glory days of the GTO had faded, horsepower ratings were dropping, compression ratios were falling, and performance was becoming a dirty word. But deep within Pontiac engineering, a handful of true believers refused to surrender. Men like Herb Adams, Tom Newell, and Assistant Chief Engineer Bill Collins quietly began working on something that would outshine anything else left in Detroit's stable. They took the existing 455 cubic inch V8, already a massive engine, and reimagined it for serious performance, not just advertising hype. What they created was something closer to a racing engine than a street motor. The SD455, or Super Duty 455, was hand-assembled with race-grade internals, forged connecting rods, strengthened main bearings, a special camshaft, round-port cylinder heads, and a unique aluminum intake manifold. Every engine was blueprinted by specialists at Pontiac's foundry. Officially, Pontiac rated it at 290 horsepower to keep insurance companies calm, but anyone who drove one knew the truth. Real-world dyno tests showed closer to 370 to 400 horsepower and a mountain of torque, easily over 500 pound-feet. In a time when most muscle cars were lucky to reach 200 horsepower, the SD455 was a rolling time machine to 1970. It wasn't just about straight-line speed either. The 1973 to 1974 Trans Am body, with its shaker scoop, fender vents, and wild, screaming chicken hood decal, made the SD look as aggressive as it drove. The new F-body platform handled surprisingly well for its size, and with the Super Duty's stiffer suspension and rear sway bar, it could carve corners with confidence no muscle car from the late 1960s ever had. Contemporary tests by Car and Driver and Road and Track were stunned. Despite smog equipment and new bumper regulations, the SD455 Trans Am could do 0 to 60 miles per hour in about 5.4 seconds, and the quarter mile in the low 13s, figures that matched or beat big block Chevelles, Hemi Chargers, and Boss 429 Mustangs from years earlier. But Pontiac's triumph came at the worst possible moment. Just as the SD455 was ready to hit the streets, the Environmental Protection Agency swooped in. The Super Duty engine was far too dirty, its emissions too high for the tightening 1973 federal standards. Pontiac had to delay its release for months, fighting with regulators over compliance. The engineers detuned the carburetors, adjusted timing, and even added primitive emissions controls to get it approved. Miraculously, it passed. Barely, but only for a short time. The 1973 oil embargo hit and performance cars suddenly became political liabilities. By 1974, the Super Duty was doomed. It was too powerful, too thirsty, and too loud for the new world of catalytic converters and corporate restraint.
In total, Pontiac built only 252 SD455 Trans Ams in 1973 and 943 in 1974, along with a handful of Formula 455 SDs. That made it rarer than almost any of its predecessors. It wasn't advertised heavily, and many dealers didn't even know it existed. Yet those who bought one knew they had something special, a car that defied extinction. One owner later said, "When you drove the Super Duty, it felt like Pontiac had smuggled the old days under your right foot." Another recalled, "You could feel the rebellion in it. It didn't care about rules, it just wanted to run." The SD455 marked the end of an era. After 1974, emissions and fuel economy regulations crushed the muscle car spirit. By 1975, catalytic converters and unleaded fuel ended high-compression engines entirely. Pontiac tried to keep the Trans Am name alive with new graphics and softer engines, but the Super Duty remained the last true heavyweight. It was a car born out of defiance, engineered in secret, built against the odds, and killed by bureaucracy. Today, collectors see the 1973 to 1974 SD455 Trans Am as one of the most important American performance cars ever built, not just for its rarity, but for what it represented. It was Detroit's final stand before surrender. The big screaming bird on its hood wasn't just decoration, it was a phoenix, a symbol of the fire that refused to die even as the muscle car age turned to ash. For one last brief, glorious moment, Pontiac's engineers looked at the rules, shrugged, and said, "Let's build it anyway." And they did.
The 1969 Ford Torino Talladega was one of those rare machines that seemed born not from a factory, but from a wind tunnel and a dream. It existed for one reason only: to win on Sunday. Built during the peak of the Aero Wars between Ford, Dodge, and Plymouth, it was not a car designed for the public highways or suburban driveways. It was designed for Talladega, Daytona, and every superspeedway where the only thing that mattered was slicing through air at 200 miles per hour. It was raw, focused, and faster than anything that had ever worn a blue oval before. But like many legends, it burned too bright and too fast. And when the rules caught up to it, the Talladega was banned into obscurity. In the late 1960s, NASCAR was no longer about brute horsepower alone. Aerodynamics had become the new frontier. Dodge had shocked the world with its Charger 500 and later the radical Daytona, reshaping its cars to cheat the wind and gain every last mile per hour on the long straightaways. Ford's engineers, led by the obsessive racing mind of Charlie Gray and the Holman and Moody racing team, knew they had to strike back, and fast. The regular Torino Cobra, even with its mighty 428 Cobra Jet engine, simply couldn't keep up with the sleek new Mopars. So Ford's engineers decided to take the Torino and reimagine it, refining its body in wind tunnels and on test tracks until it was smoother, slipperier, and faster than anything they'd ever built. The result was the Torino Talladega, named after the new Alabama superspeedway that was about to open that same year. Its nose was extended by 6 inches, the grille was recessed and angled inward, and the front bumper was specially reshaped and welded into a seamless aerodynamic cone. The rocker panels were rolled and dropped lower to reduce air drag underneath. Even the door seams were slightly modified to create less turbulence. Nothing was done for beauty. Every inch of it was sculpted for speed. The result was stunning. The Talladega could hit speeds of over 200 miles per hour in NASCAR trim, making it one of the fastest stock cars ever built to that date. It was raw, focused, and faster than anything that had ever worn a blue oval before. But like many legends, it burned too bright and too fast. And when the rules caught up to it, the Talladega was banned into obscurity. In the late 1960s, NASCAR was no longer about brute horsepower alone. Aerodynamics had become the new frontier. Dodge had shocked the world with its Charger 500 and later the radical Daytona, reshaping its cars to cheat the wind and gain every last mile per hour on the long straightaways. Ford's engineers, led by the obsessive racing mind of Charlie Gray and the Holman and Moody racing team, knew they had to strike back, and fast. The regular Torino Cobra, even with its mighty 428 Cobra jet engine, simply couldn't keep up with the sleek new Mopars. So Ford's engineers decided to take the Torino and reimagine it, refining its body in wind tunnels and on test tracks until it was smoother, slipperier, and faster than anything they'd ever built. The result was the Torino Talladega, named after the new Alabama superspeedway that was about to open that same year. Its nose was extended by 6 inches, the grille was recessed and angled inward, and the front bumper was specially reshaped and welded into a seamless aerodynamic cone. The rocker panels were rolled and dropped lower to reduce air drag underneath. Even the door seams were slightly modified to create less turbulence. Nothing was done for beauty. Every inch of it was sculpted for speed. The result was stunning. The Talladega could hit speeds of over 200 miles per hour in NASCAR trim, making it one of the fastest stock cars ever built to that date. Under the hood, Ford stuffed its mighty 428 Cobra Jet V8, officially rated at 335 horsepower, but producing closer to 400 in reality. The engine was fed by a functional ram air induction system through a hood scoop that gulped down high-pressure air at speed. The suspension was beefed up, the cooling improved, and the transmission, a heavy-duty C6 automatic, was chosen to handle the immense torque. Inside, there was nothing fancy, just a basic black interior, bucket seats, and a dash that looked ready for battle, not comfort. It was a machine that spoke the language of competition. To qualify for NASCAR, Ford had to build at least 500 street-legal versions, the homologation rule that turned race cars into road cars. In the end, Ford produced around 750 Torino Talladegas for sale to the public, most finished in 3 colors: Wimbledon white, royal maroon, or presidential blue. They were all equipped with the same 428 Cobra Jet engine and minimal options, though a few lucky buyers got factory air conditioning. Even so, it was clear these weren't meant for daily driving. The Talladega was stiff, loud, and temperamental. One owner described it as a street car with the manners of a fighter jet, all thrust, no comfort. On the track, though, it was unstoppable. Driven by legends like David Pearson and Cale Yarborough, the Talladega dominated the 1969 NASCAR season, taking multiple victories and embarrassing Dodge's aerodynamic efforts, at least until the arrival of the even more extreme Charger Daytona. For a brief, shining moment, Ford owned the air. The Talladega was faster, smoother, and more stable at high speed than anything else running on oval circuits. But success came at a cost. NASCAR, terrified by the escalating aero wars, realized that these cars were becoming dangerously fast. With lap speeds climbing past 200 miles per hour, tire technology couldn't keep up. Crashes became catastrophic, and even experienced drivers struggled to control these aerodynamic monsters. In 1970, the governing body changed the rules, effectively banning cars like the Talladega and its Plymouth and Dodge rivals by imposing engine size limits on aerodynamic models. Overnight, the era of the aero warriors was over. The Talladega had flown too close to the sun. When the dust settled, Ford quietly ended production. The Talladega became a forgotten hero, overshadowed by the flashier Superbird and Daytona, and soon disappeared from showrooms. Yet among purists and historians, it remains one of the most important cars Ford ever built. It proved that science and speed could coexist, that aerodynamics could win races as surely as horsepower. Today, surviving examples are treasured by collectors not just for their rarity, but for what they represent: the peak of unrestrained NASCAR ingenuity. For many who remember that golden age of American racing, the Talladega wasn't just a car, it was a symbol of what Detroit could do when it threw caution to the wind, literally. It embodied the moment when speed mattered more than comfort, when rules were written only after the limits were broken. One Ford engineer, years later, summed it up perfectly. The Talladega wasn't built for drivers, it was built for victory. The fact that we sold a few to the public was almost an accident.
And so it remains, a car too aerodynamic, too fast, and too pure for its own survival.
The 1970 Chevrolet Chevelle SS454 LS6 is often called the pinnacle of American muscle, a car that arrived at the absolute height of Detroit's horsepower arms race and left regulators shaking in fear. It was the very definition of too much of everything, a vehicle built for speed, torque, and sheer intimidation, and it arrived at a moment when the muscle car era teetered on the brink of regulation. With its massive 454 cubic inch big block V8, hand-fitted components, and race-bred engineering, the LS6 Chevelle was more than a car. It was a statement. Detroit could still build monsters, and the LS6 proved it beyond any doubt. Under its elongated hood lurked a V8 that was, in every sense, untamed. Rated at 450 horsepower and producing an eye-watering 500 pound-feet of torque, the LS6 454 was designed to annihilate quarter miles, steamroll freeway traffic, and leave most European sports cars in the dust. The engine featured a high-lift hydraulic cam, 11-to-1 compression, and a Holley 4-barrel carburetor, carefully balanced and matched to an aggressive dual-plane intake manifold. Exhaust headers expelled a roar that could stun anyone within earshot, a sound that became synonymous with the raw power of Detroit in 1970. Performance figures were staggering. 0 to 60 miles per hour in under 6 seconds, quarter miles in the low 13s, figures that today still earn respect and awe. But this car's greatness came with consequences. The LS6 Chevelle was a physical beast, tipping the scales at over 3,900 pounds, with a chassis barely able to cope with the engine's ferocity. Drum brakes struggled to slow it, even with heavy, finned rotors in the rear. Steering was direct but heavy, requiring effort that only the bravest could master. Drivers reported that launching the LS6 felt like wrestling a cornered bull. The torque would twist the rear tires and threaten traction at every turn. It wasn't a car for the timid. It was a car that demanded respect, skill, and guts. At the same time, America was changing. The Environmental Protection Agency, formed in 1970, began cracking down on emissions, and the Clean Air Act forced automakers to detune engines or risk federal prohibition. The LS6, with its aggressive cam, high compression, and raw carbureted design, was suddenly illegal under the new standards. GM, unwilling to compromise its monster, simply refused to certify it for road use. Overnight, what had been the most celebrated muscle car on the streets became effectively banned, a relic of unfiltered power frozen in time. Dealers who had received LS6 Chevelles sold them quickly, knowing that the future would never again allow such unrestrained engines to roam freely. Only about 1,800 LS6 Chevelles were built for 1970, making it an incredibly rare car even in its own era. Owners who survived the initial shock recall a vehicle that could feel alive, almost dangerous on public roads. One driver described it as a car that doesn't accelerate, it detonates. You feel the road bending beneath you, the tires screaming, the engine pulling like it's alive. Another remembered, it wasn't just a car, it was a test of your courage every time you touched the throttle. The LS6 Chevelle demanded more than driving skill. It demanded respect. In hindsight, the 1970 Chevelle SS454 LS6 stands as a monument to the last unshackled days of American muscle. It was the ultimate performance machine, built before emissions laws, insurance restrictions, and the oil crisis tamed Detroit's wildest engineers. The LS6 didn't just make speed, it defined it, leaving a lasting legacy of power that could never be matched again in a production car of its time. Today, surviving LS6s are priceless, celebrated at car shows, cherished by collectors, and revered as the ultimate muscle car, a band king whose roar still echoes half a century later, reminding the world of the raw, unfiltered intensity that American engineers once dared to unleash.
The 1970 AMC Rebel Machine is one of those fleeting, incandescent moments in American automotive history when a smaller company dared to go toe-to-toe with Detroit's giants and almost rewrote the rules of muscle. AMC, often thought of as the underdog, a minor player in the shadow of Ford, GM, and Chrysler, quietly plotted a car that would shock the muscle car world. While the big three were entrenched in the horsepower wars, AMC's engineers and marketing team realized that sheer audacity could carry a mid-size car further than brand prestige ever could. The result was the Rebel Machine, a car that wore its intentions boldly on every surface, from its red, white, and blue paint scheme to the graphic screaming "performance first, subtlety never." It was a statement of rebellion, designed to challenge the status quo, to be noticed, to be feared, and to leave an indelible mark in the shortest possible time. Under its elongated hood lurked the beating heart of the machine, the AMC 390 cubic-inch V8, a part of the company's celebrated Gen 2 engine family. Despite AMC's reputation for conservatism, the machine's 390 was far from mild. Rated officially at 340 horsepower, insiders estimated it produced closer to 380 horsepower when fully warmed and properly tuned. Torque was an equally imposing 430 pound-feet, immediately translating to a car that lunged forward the instant the throttle was touched. The power was delivered through a heavy-duty 4-speed manual, complete with a Hurst shifter in many cases, or an optional 3-speed automatic, paired with AMC's 10-bolt rear differential. On the quarter-mile, it could challenge and surpass many contemporary Mustangs, Camaros, and even Chevelles in raw acceleration. One owner later said, "When you launched the machine, it felt like the car had a mind of its own. You weren't driving it, you were trying to survive it." The acceleration was intoxicating, but it demanded respect. A novice could easily find themselves overwhelmed, especially with the rear tires struggling to grip and the suspension tuned for speed rather than comfort. The car's design reflected its intentions. Aerodynamics weren't as extreme as a Daytona or Superbird, but every line of the Rebel Machine was purposeful. The shaker hood scoop wasn't a mere decoration, it fed cooler, high-pressure air directly to the 390, enhancing combustion and power output. Front and rear spoilers, mag-style wheels, and wide tires were carefully chosen to improve handling and traction. Inside, the cabin was a combination of sporty and functional. Gauges directly visible to the driver, racing-inspired seats that kept occupants planted, and controls that emphasized performance over convenience. The machine was a drag racer disguised as a street car, and AMC made no excuses for it. Yet brilliance often comes at a cost, and the Rebel Machine's brilliance was also the source of its rapid undoing. Its raw power, aggressive emissions output, and uncompromising mechanical design quickly ran afoul of state and federal regulations. By 1971, new emission standards, along with local noise ordinances, meant that the car was illegal in several key markets, including California, which represented a substantial portion of the muscle car market. Safety inspectors noted the car's high-performance chassis and suspension as unpredictable at the limit, particularly in urban traffic. Dealers began returning unsold inventory to AMC, and the company, unwilling to compromise or modify the car extensively, quietly discontinued the machine after only one model year. In total, fewer than 2,500 units were built, making it one of the rarest muscle cars of its era. Collectors and enthusiasts who survived the early years recall the machine as an almost mythic vehicle, a full-size sedan with the heart of a drag racer and the soul of a rebel. One remembered, it wasn't just a car, it was a challenge. You could see the other drivers on the street get nervous when they spotted the paint, and then it would leap forward and vanish like a red, white, and blue phantom. Another said, driving the Rebel Machine was like shaking hands with a live wire, thrilling, terrifying, and addictive. It demanded respect every inch of the way. The car's bold colors, powerful engine, and limited production turned it into an instant legend. The 1970 AMC Rebel Machine wasn't just a muscle car. It was a statement about possibility, about audacity, about how even the smallest player in Detroit could disrupt an industry dominated by giants. Its single model year, its daring design, and its outlaw status made it a symbol of both triumph and tragedy, proof that brilliance can be as fleeting as it is bold.
When environmental laws, safety regulations, and insurance restrictions closed the window on unrestricted horsepower, the Rebel Machine was swept away, buried under the weight of legality, bureaucracy, and practicality. Yet its legend endures, preserved in stories, photographs, and in the hearts of enthusiasts who understand what it meant to drive a car that defied convention, dared to be different, and burned brightly, if only for one blazing year.
The Ford Pinto stands as one of the most infamous cautionary tales in automotive history, a car whose story transcends horsepower, styling, and innovation to become a grim lesson in ethics, engineering, and corporate responsibility. Introduced in 1971, the Pinto was Ford's answer to the growing wave of small, fuel-efficient imports from Japan and Europe. The company wanted a cheap, nimble, and stylish subcompact that could capture a new generation of drivers, a car that would sell in high volumes and pad the bottom line. On the surface, the Pinto delivered exactly that. It was small, lightweight, inexpensive, and maneuverable. It promised practicality and economy at a time when Americans were increasingly concerned about rising fuel costs and the allure of imported compacts. But beneath the sheet metal lurked a danger so profound it would define the Pinto's legacy forever. The problem centered on the car's fuel system. Ford engineers had placed the gas tank behind the rear axle to maximize interior space and reduce production costs. This positioning, however, left the tank dangerously exposed to rear-end collisions. Even minor crashes could puncture the tank, allowing gasoline to ignite upon impact. The design flaw was not theoretical, it was confirmed repeatedly in internal crash tests. Yet, in an infamous demonstration of corporate cost-benefit analysis gone wrong, Ford executives calculated that the expense of redesigning the car to make it safe would exceed the financial cost of anticipated burn injury lawsuits. This cold calculus, outlined in internal memos, revealed a chilling prioritization of profit over human life. It was an engineering nightmare wrapped in a business decision that would haunt the company for decades. Real-world tragedies soon followed. Across the United States, hundreds of drivers and passengers died in fiery Pinto crashes. The collisions were often at relatively low speeds, 20 to 30 miles per hour, crashes that in any other car might have resulted in minor injuries. Yet in a Pinto, these accidents could erupt into devastating infernos, leaving victims trapped inside as flames engulfed the cabin. Emergency responders reported arriving at scenes where the car was nothing more than a metal coffin, blackened and twisted. Families were destroyed, lives ended prematurely, and communities were shocked by the seemingly routine yet lethal nature of these collisions. The horror stories became front-page news and ignited a nationwide debate on automotive safety, corporate ethics, and consumer protection. Public outrage reached a fever pitch when investigative journalists and consumer advocates, most famously Ralph Nader, exposed Ford's internal calculations, the memo that compared the cost of fixing the Pinto to the projected cost of lawsuits and the pattern of negligence that allowed such a dangerous car to reach the market. The narrative was damning. It wasn't just that the Pinto could explode in a crash, it was that Ford had known, documented, and effectively decided to let it happen. This revelation ignited federal investigations, lawsuits, and a massive recall. By 1978, more than 1.5 million Pintos had been recalled to address the rear fuel system, an unprecedented action for a car that had already been on the road for years. Even then, the damage to Ford's reputation was indelible, and the Pinto became a symbol of corporate malfeasance. From an engineering perspective, the Pinto was competent in many areas. It was compact, economical, and even offered decent handling for its era. Its small engine and lightweight chassis made it agile in urban traffic, and it could be considered an effective transportation solution for budget-conscious drivers. Yet all of these qualities were overshadowed by its lethal flaw. Owners of the Pinto often reported that it felt safe and reliable in everyday driving conditions, yet the knowledge of its catastrophic potential hung over the model like a shadow. Many described the experience as riding a ticking time bomb, where normal driving could suddenly turn into tragedy. One owner remarked, "You trusted it until someone tapped you from behind, and then you prayed to survive." The Pinto's legacy extends far beyond the tragic crashes. It transformed how automakers, regulators, and the public viewed vehicle safety. The U.S. National Highway Traffic Safety Administration began to enforce stricter rear-end impact tests, fuel tank protections, and safety standards, setting precedents that would shape the design of all small cars thereafter. Engineering schools and business ethics courses dissected the Pinto case for decades, illustrating the deadly consequences of placing profit above human life.
It is taught not as a story of mechanical failure alone, but as a profound moral lesson. Even a well-designed car in every other respect can become a weapon if ethical considerations are ignored. In the cultural consciousness, the Ford Pinto has become more than a car. It is shorthand for preventable disaster. It occupies a dark corner of automotive history alongside other infamous machines whose danger was as much ethical as it was mechanical. Films, documentaries, and countless articles have chronicled its rise and fall, ensuring that every generation of drivers understands the dual lessons of safety and accountability. Despite its small size, modest engine, and unassuming appearance, the Pinto looms large, a reminder that the smallest cars can carry the heaviest consequences. Today, surviving Pintos are collector's items, but their allure is tinged with the story of their deadly past. Enthusiasts who restore or drive them often do so with full awareness of the car's history, seeing it as a cautionary piece of engineering history rather than a trophy of triumph. For them, the Pinto is a paradox. It is simultaneously a classic subcompact of the 1970s and a living monument to what happens when human life is subordinated to corporate bottom lines. Its place in history is secure, not for style, performance, or innovation, but for its stark lesson. The Ford Pinto was a car banned not merely in regulation, but morally, ethically, and in the court of public opinion. It remains a chilling, unforgettable symbol of what can happen when engineering brilliance is corrupted by human indifference.